Good morning, everyone. Welcome to session 2 of the AfCFTA Go Global webinar series. It's great to see such strong participation today from founders and operators to policymakers and ecosystem partners across the continent. This session is brought to you by the Trade Desk of the Federal Ministry of Communication, Innovation and Digital Economy. And we are pleased to be convening this conversation at a moment when cross-border digital trade under the AfCFTA is becoming increasingly real. Before we dive in, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge and appreciate our partners whose support makes this series very, very possible. Our technical partners are GFA and Swift Fusion, and they are the one providing technical backup that supports today's engagement. We're also grateful to our supporting partners, Champs and eTransact PLC, both long-standing contributors to Africa's digital identity and payment ecosystem. Thank you all, our partners, for being continued commitment to strengthen Africa's digital public infrastructure and trade ecosystem. In our first session, we focused on AfCFTA readiness, what business need to prepare before attempting to scale across borders. Today, we move one layer deeper because no matter how strong your product or business model is, cross-border scale only works when the underlying rail works. Today's session is titled DPI as a Launchpad for Market Entry. We'll be focusing on how identity systems, payments, infrastructure, data, and interoperability quietly but decisively determine whether digital services can scale across African markets. By the end of today's session, the core outcome is simple. You should clearly understand how digital public infrastructure underpins scalable, trust cross-border digital services, and what that means for your own market entry strategy. We will hear from each speaker, and after each presentation, we'll pause briefly for questions and reflections. So please, take your time, listen attentively, look at the chat box. You see a link to a Slido link. When the presenter is presenting, if you have any question, go on that Slido link and put in your question. Once the presenter is done, the presenter will then have some minutes to answer all the questions you're asking. Now, we begin with the ecosystem and trust layer of DPI. When businesses think about scaling digitally across the border, questions around data sovereignty, infrastructure resilience, and trust often surface later than they should. To help us frame this properly, I'm pleased to welcome Mr. Adebola Omololu, who you can also call Debo. He is the Chief Executive Officer of GFA Data Centre. GFA operates at a critical junction of Africa's digital economy, supporting government and enterprises with secure, sovereign, and resilient infrastructure. Mr. Debo will help us understand DPI as an ecosystem and why trust, sovereignty, and infrastructure readiness are foundational for cross-border scale. Mr. Debo, welcome, and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Oluwase. And thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So I would share my screen and just take us through a few slides. Typically, when I speak at sessions like this, I'm always happy to have people, pause me sometimes if required, and then it's more of an engagement. So today I'll be sharing my thoughts, especially as with regards to digital public structure. And in a way, I'm going to highlight my thoughts and why I think we should take things even more seriously than we currently do. So let me say and my opening statement is something that we kind of like already know, but we don't necessarily, we're not necessarily very aware of the impact or implication of what we're doing, especially from the digital infrastructure and the age that we're in. So very simply, today, Nigeria is exporting data, raw data, I should say. So if you think about it, we are one of the most data-rich countries in the world because every day we generate enormous volumes of data. So our WhatsApp calls, our video streaming, our engagement on social media, the creatives or the creation of content across platforms like YouTube, etc. The amount of information we generate from e-commerce, on logistics platforms, data from hospital visits, data from farms, from school, from interaction with governments. Our population of 200 million plus people, I believe that 230, 240, if you add Nigerians in diaspora, another like 30 million. So generally speaking, our population of, I could say 250 million plus people means that we are a breathing data engine. Now, here's the problem. We generate a lot of data, but what we really do is that we export this data and we import intelligence. So if you think of all the data that we generate, just a small percentage of it actually stays in Nigeria. So according to various experts, they say that 80% of the data that is generated in Nigeria is actually stored and processed in Nigeria. Some experts say that that number is actually as high as 80%. And it's not far-fetched to think of why. Some estimates are that Nigeria today, as at the end of 2025, generated about 700 megawatts of IT load. That's kind of like how the size of data is captured. Now, if you think about it, of that 700 or 750 megawatts of IT load of data that was generated, the pipeline, and when I say pipeline, not that it's active yet, pipeline that we currently have is only around 100 megawatts of IT load that we can actually store and process within the country. What actually exists today is roughly around like 60 megawatts. So we need 700 megawatts of IT load. We have, in terms of capacity locally, 60 megawatts of IT load. What this means is that we export data and we import intelligence. We import this intelligence in the form of models, analytics engines, SaaS tools, software as a service tools, various cloud platforms, decision systems, and intelligence systems out there. The reality is that by exporting data and importing intelligence, we're creating a doom loop, and we've seen this before. Let me tell you how this doom loop actually works. So essentially, we generate raw data, behavioral data, transactional data, health data, all the various types that I had mentioned before. This data is stored, it's processed, and then it's trained outside of Nigeria, mostly in foreign data centers, usually hyperscale, but in foreign data centers. And these foreign companies use that data intelligence on top of the data that has been trained. Everything from AI tools, credit scoring, logistics optimization, advertising platforms, diagnostic engines, etc. And then Nigeria buys all these APIs, SaaS tools, and cloud subscription. And as we digitize, we then have to leverage all of these tools where the raw data was actually exported from us. In fact, this is close to, very, very similar to what has happened hitherto in the oil and gas industry, where we generated crude oil, sold it to refiners in other countries, now sold those refined products back to us. It's true in our digital infrastructure industry as well. So in this loop, because we then buy back all these APIs, our businesses become dependent on all of these tools that have with our own data. Our costs rise and our digital sovereignty weakens. The cycle repeats itself, stronger and stronger and stronger. So some of you might know some of the reasons why, there's a lot of pressure on the Naira, especially from the tech world, where many organizations to pay for a lot of the services in US dollars. And when we didn't have enough, it was a big problem, and that added pressure to the Naira. So the reality is we have a doom loop, we have a problem, and it's a big one. So who generates all this data? Our startups, our banks, our hospitals, our governments, our fintechs, our creatives, our farmers, you. In the world we live in now, we cannot afford, or that it's inevitable that we have to generate some kinds of data. And today, because of AI and many other things, even that data and data ownership is sometimes a gray area. You have things like GDPR, or in Nigeria's case, NDPR, data protection rights, because now there's an argument, if I use Facebook, which was built by Facebook, is that data owned by Facebook or by me, right? So there are a lot of discussions around that. All of this is infrastructure that we don't own or control. The reality is whoever controls that compute layer controls the data, or controls the innovation layer. So before now, in the 20th century, countries actually competed on oil, they competed on steel, competed on manufacturing. In the current century that we live in, countries and nations are going to be competing on data, on compute, on cloud infrastructure, on digital sovereignty. There is no serious AI economy, or even just, let's not even say AI, any digital economy that can exist without serious data centers. No digital economy can scale without domestic cloud capacity, and no nation can claim technological independence if all of its intelligence is built elsewhere. So you'll understand what I said in the beginning, that we're exporting raw data and importing intelligence, and as a country, we cannot claim to be digitizing our economy if we're relying on external parties, especially in the current geopolitical world that we live in. I could go on and on about the geopolitical, but we all kind of know what is happening out there. So if we're serious, what should we really be doing? So for us, we're emphasizing, and one of the reasons I'm passionate about this and why I'm really happy to be here today, is that we don't seem to be seeing the kind of things that I'm seeing and many other people are seeing. It's not just about the market. We see a national vulnerability for us as a country. Nigeria doesn't lack talent, it doesn't lack ideas, it doesn't lack ambition. What we lack is that opportunity to have compute at scale and for people to actually build on top of this. And that's one of the reasons that our group, the GFA Technologies Group, decided to set up what we call a subsidiary of the group, GFA Data Centre, to actually fix this problem. Our mission is simple. We want to keep Nigeria's data in Nigeria and provide that platform and infrastructure for all of our smart people to build on top of, to have Nigerian data within Nigeria. We want to build Nigeria's intelligence, and we want to power Africa's digital future from Africa. That's kind of what we want to do. In order to do this, what we've planned, and we're now executing in phases, we have a 10-year strategy to set up a 200 megawatt data center. And we're doing it in phases. Actually, we're launching phase 1 next quarter, in quarter 2 of this year. And what we've also done is to develop a sort of sub-national strategy. Now, Nigeria is one indivisible country, I believe. However, from an economic point of view, we need to look at each state as its own economy. Just some of made where if we're to take, let's say, and I just use this as an example, if we're to take Lagos State as an economy, so yes, it's part of Nigeria, the country, but if you take Lagos State as an economy, it is going to be one of the top 10 economies across all 55 countries on the African, 5 countries and regions across Africa. And so what that means is that if we look at every state as its own digital economy, then what we really should be doing is actually going subnational and actually taking each state, developing something, and then literally doing like a rinse and repeat across board. And so our plan of having this digital infrastructure is really more of how can we do this in one state and then duplicate it across board. So for us, it's important, even these data centers that we all know is very important, but we don't necessarily even understand or connect the dots. So today, Lagos is where most of the data centers are located, because typically they're connected, many of the internet cables, submarine cables that land, most of them are in Lagos. And then it's then taken from the submarine cables to the terrestrial cables and then pulled across all the regions in the country. So there's an over-centralization. And so this creates fragility, congestion, and a systemic risk. So for us, we believe that Nigeria's emergence as a hub will be achieved on a state-by-state basis through subnational execution that aligns with our local policies and power. And there's a lot of work that the Ministry of Communication and Digital Economy has been doing in this regard. For us, we've chosen Abeokuta, and this is where we're going to be creating our 200 megawatt data center. So our model is sort of like to create that infrastructure that allows even other data centers to even within our data centers, if that makes any sense. I'm just oversimplifying. So a location that allows data centers to set up data centers, right? So that's kind of like a data center campus. And we're doing this in Ogun State with that proximity to Lake congestion risk and access to the whole campus scale thing. Now, here's the thing, very obvious. One of the reasons why we haven't scaled as a country from a data center point of view, beyond data center, I should even say digital infrastructure point of view, is power. Power accounts for 80%, depending on the operator, of the operating cost of most of the data centers, not just in Nigeria, but Africa as a whole. And so our own multi-layered architecture combines grid power, gas power, renewable energy as well, such that we have this campus that today is powered by just types of things. And that was the first thing we had to spend a lot of time, almost 2 years, trying to solve, having both captive power as well as other forms of power. And so having this whole model allows us not just to build for hyperscalers. Hyperscalers are typically the foreign companies that leverage a lot of this data. You know, some of them, Meta, Google, Palantir, just to mention a few. And so we're building at hyperscale standards, meaning that we're not waiting for the hyperscalers to come in. We are actually digitizing or digitalizing various aspects of government. And I'm very happy that, you know, you have organizations like CHAMS in here. One of the pioneers and leaders, especially in the side of identity management and payments and things like that. So infrastructure does not just create a hub, demand does. So for us, the way we're doing it, one of our pilot programs is digitalizing all 20 local governments in Ogun State. Remember what I said about once you have a data center in a location, can you do it on a state by state level, or can you do it a pilot in one location and then duplicate it across all states in Nigeria? The reality is that public infrastructure skills, rails, and actions. Identity and record management. I mentioned CHAMS. Think of citizen services and other things. Payments, revenue collection, financial systems, our fintechs, etc. Data and land. asset planning, even the digitalization of the data that we have, and then the ability to train and the ability to service everybody. Let me just go off script briefly. The reality is that just like I use the analogy of the oil and gas industry, once you have large enough data centers and the ability for example, the telecom companies to connect and talk to each other, as well as peering, what happens is that the cost of data gradually drops. So today, many people would say data is a bit expensive, but that's primarily because we don't have enough of the infrastructure that enables things like communication to happen at a lower price. It's still exported and imported. And so with large enough data centers and with our model and the things that we see, we're able to lower the cost of data. Lowering the cost of data increases productivity and increases income for everyone. And this is why DPI is so important. It's a repeatable national model with what we're doing. 5 simple steps. We partner with subnational governments. We digitize public services. We localize the resulting data. And then that anchor demand on hyperscale infrastructure at hyperscale standards comes from local companies, local governments, local organizations. And we're not necessarily waiting for the global hyperscalers. And this allows us to scale sustainably. Ownership is key because hyperscale infrastructure requires patient long-term capital. For us, we're lucky. We have both financial and technical support from multiple organizations, including, just to mention a few, Sovereign Investment Authority, Ministry of Finance Incorporated, outside of Nigeria, the Mubadala Group, IFC, Sweden, Sweet Fund, you know, I said we have that support from a technical, advisory, financial, and so, but it's important that ownership also plays a part of it. So in our roadmap, our goal is also to list our data center, GDC, even as we grow on a phase-by-phase basis in terms of capacity, to allow Nigerians to own a stake in this critical digital infrastructure. And because, again, this digital infrastructure involves within Nigeria and even from West Africa as a whole, it means that even people who eventually, when we do so on list, will have that access in terms of investment and ownership across Africa. So in conclusion, the digital future will not be built on hope or hype or diesel generators. It will be built on power-first execution, disciplined capital, and intentional infrastructure strategy. And we need to make sure, in closing, that Nigeria's digital infrastructure or Nigeria's data stays within Nigeria. It is important that we pass regulations that, you know, data of things like Nigerian data of Nigerians in banks and things like that are stored within Nigeria. I'll stop sharing now and we're happy to answer any questions. Thank you for your time. I think you're on mute.
Thank you, Debo. Thank you very much, Debo. That was a strong foundation. We'll pause here for a few questions while this is fresh. If you're thinking about where your data should live, regulatory expectations, or trust, you know, across borders, please drop your questions in the Q&A link on here in the chat room and in the WhatsApp group. Thank you, Debo. Now we go into the question and answer. Can we start having the questions, please? Okay, just give us a few minutes. They're extracting all the questions. We can see loads of questions coming in.
Okay, I think while the questions are coming in, I can just take some of the questions. I'll read them out and then answer some of them, of course, and then as the others pop up, I can take those. Is that okay?
Yes, go ahead, Debo.
Okay, so the questions in the Q&A. So what are the solutions in place to avoid data breaches and protection, and what could be done on the data collected? That's a very valid question. And so typically, if you think of your data centers, a lot of times, some of us, myself included, just go on and talk as if, everybody is aware. But a data center is technically a place, a secure place, sort of like a vault where data is stored and processed securely. And so what that means is that there are security procedures in place in terms of accessing the data and even accessing the servers and things like that. So you have data centers almost like the way a bank stores money, because data is life, as they say, and so there's that storage. So you have different levels of data centers, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, etc. And basically with all of these tiers, then comes the level of, security, protection, both physical as well as digital. So for you to run a data center, and even the standards that are required. Remember I said we work with global standards for us in GDC, GFA Data Centre. And so based on that, a lot a lot goes into physical and digital protection. We don't collect the data, so we literally help to store and process. And so we're not the ones collecting the data. So if, for example, you work with a bank, so your data is stored with the bank or in the bank servers, right? And the bank also takes steps to ensure that your data is stored and secured. And I think data security is a key question that we have. How is data localization in Nigeria going to help with Africa's integration plans? Wouldn't that be counterproductive? No, actually. Data localization helps ensure that we're able to aggregate data in Nigeria, and it reduces, I talked about the cost of data for Nigeria generally, and then it also improves the quality of communication and digitalization. Here's what I mean. Many of you would relate, maybe on WhatsApp. You call somebody on WhatsApp and then suddenly it starts doing pop-pum, pop-pum, and it's not connecting, or you can't hear the person anymore. Or maybe even as I'm talking in this presentation, I think I saw someone saying their connectivity was bad, so they couldn't hear what I was saying consistently. What's really happening is that because we don't have infrastructure in Nigeria, that data leaves Nigeria or leaves your phone or your laptop, goes to probably somewhere in Europe, right? Gets processed in the data center in Europe, then comes back to us here, right? And so sometimes that lag, it's called latency, is why there are challenges in communication. And this then becomes even more important when you think of the ability for maybe like in hospitals for people to be able to operate remotely. It's almost not possible because of the latency and the things that we don't have. So no, it doesn't. It's not counterproductive. We actually need even more data centers because, as I said, there's a huge gap in terms of what we have and what we expect. Could we please share policy hurdles that we have in order to scale efficiently and execute? It's two ways. One, we need legislation. I know that NIDA has shared a guideline on some Nigerian data staying in Nigeria, right? But we need to kind of like legalize it, make it into a law. Because it doesn't make sense if, let's say you have a bank account and your bank transactions and everything is stored, is processed, and then is stored abroad. To me, I don't think this is the way to go. So I think that the key policy hurdle is to make sure that we state that some part of Nigerian data, we need to treat data as part of our sovereignty. In fact, if some of you recall, in the US, they have said that data centers are now national security apparatus, right? Both public and private data centers. And so we need similar things because it is very, very important. And so that's one policy challenge that we need to take up. Let me skip to Slido. What's the role of government policy in achieving a sovereign data protection? How are we ensuring we meet the data center standards in Nigeria? Very important. And just as I mentioned, we need to treat data as part of our national security. And to do that, we need to ensure that we have regulations around the kind of data or storing Nigerian data within Nigeria. Many countries actually have this. The US, China, India, just to mention a few. They actually have regulations around storing their data within their country because they understand the model and the doom loop that I mentioned. Trust is critical for cross-border digital services. How does data localization versus regional data sharing affect trust in Africa's DPI ecosystem? Thank you for that question. And my response is that it's both ways. Nigeria should be a data center hub because we have hundreds of millions of people and we can process and store data at scale. And so for West Africa especially, we can work with our West African brothers, especially even around areas of disaster recovery, which is one of the things that GFA Data Centre also does. So if you think of, let's say Ghana, it makes sense that Ghana has their own digital centers within Ghana. And just so that in case anything happens, they have a backup, let's say in Nigeria, especially with things that involve Nigeria and Ghana hand in glove, right? So that's how I see it, where there is, there's something I say, generally speaking, that for you to have trust, you need to remove the need for trust. What it means is that by digitizing things, you have the ability for all parties to see what each party sees and for you to control the data that affects you. And that's kind of like where I'm going with some of my comments. I see that there are a lot of questions, and sometimes before I answer the questions, something has already slipped up, but let me just see. What role do neutral, commercially run infrastructure players like data centers play in enabling interoperability within national DPI systems? Huge role, huge role. We're a carrier neutral organization, for example, at GTC. That means is that within our data center, the various players, cloud service providers, telecom operators, internet service providers can talk to each other, right? And so having a carrier neutral facility is important because it enables that individual communication. And again, just I can't emphasize this enough, reduces the latency. That's the quality of the service. It reduces the cost. And by reducing the cost, you literally unleash the creativity and capacity of every Nigerian. what infrastructure constraints quietly limit scale when a digital service expands from one African country, from one African market to 5 or 10? That's an interesting one, and that even affects us directly. So under the GFA Technologies Group, we have like some of our subsidiaries. So I'll mention one. There's Remzana that actually operates in about 7 African countries. And our major challenge initially was even localizing that service and then even having access to those services in those countries because of cost of data, right? Now, what we've ended up doing is literally leveraging cloud to allow that happen at lower cost and with better quality of services, so to say. LAGS is a company focused in digital technology for agriculture in Angola. How can we apply these data solutions? It's interesting that you mentioned this because, now with a data center, you have the ability to store and process data, right? And then you then have various types of chips that allow for software training. Today, NVIDIA's GPSs are major microchips that are available. And you have Google's and TPUs. I mentioned chips because what it does is that it allows you to train data and be able to use technology in such a way that maybe we wouldn't have been able to do manually. So for example, in partnership with the Nigerian office of AfCFTA, we're working on what we call a COCO command for Nigeria. And this is probably something that can then be duplicated in other countries, where for cocoa especially, and again, as I said, for other commodities eventually, we are training AI models around leveraging the weather, the soil quality, satellite imagery, and many other things to be able to increase the yield of cocoa from Nigeria, as well as the quality of that cocoa as well, right? And so if you then realize that that would not have been possible without some of the training, the base layers that we have. So if you think of the data center literally as the base layer, right, we won't have been able to do some of those things. So that training is going on, and these are some of the digital technologies, as you can imagine, that can be used for agriculture. And of course, this can be done in other countries as well. What needs to happen for Nigeria to have its own data sovereignty? So I kind of have mentioned that we need the regulations, and then we need to unlock power. That's a very key part of things. As I said, our model is a data center campus, so it's huge. The 200 megawatt plan at completion over the next 10 years will be the biggest data center in West Africa and one of the biggest ones in Africa. So that then allows for us to be able to say, okay, we have the capacity locally to store, to process this data, and this then helps side by side with regulation of storing Nigerian data in Nigeria and helps with our data sovereignty. Question here, I work with a hyperscaler. Welcome the chance to support this goal for my country. What partnerships or expertise are you seeking to collaborate? Many, but we typically do everything in combination and in partnership with AfCFTA, Nigerian office of AfCFTA. So please feel free to reach out to the AfCFTA team, and they will then, kind of bring us together, so to say, so we can share what we're doing in Nigeria and potentially work with you in your country. I think I have covered all of them. Just in case I have missed any, please forgive.
That was a whole lot. Thank you very much, Debo. That was a fantastic job. Thank you for those insights. I think you've done justice to much of the questions people are asking. We've shared your presentation with the group, so people are going to probably reach out once they do. We'll create a channel to which you can get to answer more questions if need be. So now let's move from the ecosystem view to the operational realities of scale. As many founders discover, scaling across African markets introduces, a different level of challenge. It introduces very real infrastructure challenges, from latency to uptime to redundancy to compliance and performance consistency. Now, to walk us through this, I'm delighted to introduce Mr. Adebola, who will be sitting in for Mr. Sunday Opadijo. Mr. Sunday is the head of data center and operations for Rack Center. Mr. Dyer, who will be sitting in for him, is the marketing manager, and he brings deep hands-on experience in hosting operational resilience and Pan-African infrastructures, supporting platform that needs to perform reliably across borders. He will focus on practical infrastructure and hosting decisions. We're looking at practical infrastructure and hosting decision businesses. You must get it right to scale successfully. With that in mind, I would like to welcome Mr. Dedayo from Rack Center. Welcome, Mr. Dedayo. Thank you.
Thank you, Luwashi. So I'd just like to make a correction. It's actually Adebola. And the main reason why I'm saying this is because they highlighted Mr. Dedayo, so he doesn't scare off and ask why they are calling his name. So yeah, it's actually this video. All right. I don't know, am I highlighted yet?
Yes, you are. Shoot.
All right, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. So Mr. Sunday was meant to have this session, but he was unavoidably unavailable. So I'll just be stepping in for him. My name is Adebola Difarati. I'm the head of marketing and communications at Rack Center. And I would like to, we're talking about the engine room, basically. I'd like to thank Mr. Debo for, his session. It was very, very informative. As people in this ecosystem, we know the challenges it takes to actually have a data center. So I'll just get into it. So when we talk about AF's Africa Continental Free Trade Area, most people focus on, the policies, the politics, the protocols, apps and all of that. But today we'll be talking about the engine room. And as Rack Center, we view DPI not just as a critical technical framework, but also the physical rails that determine how fast and how well African trade can travel. So think about it. You cannot have a single market of digital trade if that, like Mr. Debo said, the data has to leave the continent, to say Europe or North America before coming back to Nigeria. So for instance, you want to verify somebody's identification and it's leaving at cost, but that doesn't make sense because ultimately that creates more points for this data to travel and also increases costs and risk. All right. So to start off, I would like just also have like this critical small idea to ask ourselves what actually powers the internet. So when some people ask themselves this question, what powers the internet? I'm sure the first thing you might see in your head is the sky and satellites and things being up there. But really the world or the internet is basically connected by simply put wires, but in this case, fiber optic cables. So this is a map of, the world's internet connection. So you can see Africa, you can see all these cables are literally interconnected to each other and all the continents are connected. And these are subsea cables that actually put fiber optic cables that put in the oceans and the seas and, are connecting everybody. So this is how the internet works. And at all of these points here, that's where data centers come in because these are the places where all these cables come in, all of that data comes in, and then it's now put into good use, your internet. So you're accessing Facebook, it has to touch a Facebook server in California and, transfer all the way to Nigeria. And so the internet is not infrastructure that happens in the sky or this thing. It's actually physical infrastructure on the ground. And this is where data centers actually play a very, very vital role in that. So I'll just say this, software, and I think, Mr. Debo has also alluded to this. Software cannot scale across Africa if hardware is not localized, resilient, and interconnected. So it's not just one thing for us to have these data centers, and say, okay, we have our own in Africa, come and host it, because of the quality of services that these companies are looking for, it has to be very, very resilient. And I'm sure if we talk about the Nigerian power, issues, I don't think anybody on this call has ever been a generation where you've had 24 hours power. So we're a very power derived or derived economy. And how do you build resilience for that? How do people ensure that anytime they want to make a transaction, it goes without thinking about it and praying that there's light in their bank, And also everything has to be interconnected, meaning you cannot run it in silos, to drive this ecosystem, to drive the system and all of these things, there has to be an ecosystem and everybody has to be connected into that. So the data centers have to be connected, the telcos have to be connected, everybody has to come together to ensure that everything is working. If not, when you create silos, you create a single point of failure. And once that person goes down, everybody goes down. So you do not really want that. And I think this is a testament to what happened, say, I think a year or two ago, when a cable cut and then the entire Nigeria was out of internet for some days, but yeah. So the 4 pillars of this session are identity, which is basically the how the businesses identify you, your own personal data, your KYC requirements and all of that for both businesses and individual. Payments, which are, frictionless cross-border settlements powering trade across Africa. Data centers, the physical location where all of the customer data and transactions are both stored and retrieved when they want to be used. And interoperability, basically determining how the policies and the processes that allow all the systems to talk across each other we're talking about 54 different countries with 54 different languages and 54 different systems. So how do you ensure that everybody's talking together? And I would like to illustrate this with this diagram here. And I'll use the system of a train station or a railway system. In the railway system, there is the track, which is more or less the connectivity, the fiber optics, and the towers and all of that. But on these tracks, there are particular things we call the gauges, where they say a track should be 12 feet. A track should be 12 feet wide. It should be this particular amount of inches thick. It should be able to carry this amount of loads. So you see those particular things. That's what interoperability also is. Interoperability is saying, okay, when I want to communicate user ID or transaction data to Ghana, how do I actually pass that information across? This is the system, this is the way, this is the logic. Do we put dates before month or months before date? So that's basically what interoperability drives. How do you communicate? What are the systems and the processes? And on these tracks, you have things like data and payments. So data like information, identity data, and also payment information, which are basically the cargo on these rails. And all of this system works together. And the data center is where all of these rails, this cargo, everything comes together and there's an exchange. People get off, people get on, cargo is loaded off, cargo is loaded on, and all of that. And this is basically the ecosystem and how the ecosystem works. So you have the data center that is a central point, the cargo in terms of transaction data, payment identity, and also the interoperability that is defining how everybody should communicate. What are the standards we actually want to use to communicate across board? And at the end of everything, so I'll now start from, let's talking about the layer 0. So the layer 0 is the critical thing that is needed for trade, and that's basically infrastructure. If there's no infrastructure, the AfCFTA cannot work. And that's basically where the digital public infrastructure comes in via things like NIN, identification, and also in this case, PAPs. And data center is the ground that it is built on. It is where all of these things are hosted and all these things are stored and then retrieved. And without a data center, you cannot actually there's no way these things can work, because then are you storing these things outside? Even if you want to store them outside the country, you still need data centers. And the issue, like as I think highlighted earlier, is the lengthy data center transit. In the older days, most of the data was hosted outside Nigeria. But what we're increasingly seeing now is because of the infrastructure is being here, you now have things, certain data being, data sovereignty laws are actually kicking in. And we're not necessarily routing through Europe again. So for instance, NIN is fully stored in Nigeria now. Banks are actually storing all your transaction data in Nigeria now because the CBN has actually mandated that. So we are increasingly seeing data sovereignty laws pick up. And in other places where you now start seeing more of that is, with your media consumption, for instance. Yes, these media companies used to use our foreign companies, say your YouTube, your TikTok, and all of that. But with increasing nationality and data sovereignty laws and stronger data sovereignty laws, there will become a day where all the videos generated in Nigeria will stay in Nigeria, all the user data for that will stay in Nigeria, the critical data will stay in Nigeria, like what we saw with the US acquisition of TikTok, buying the TikTok end or the US end of TikTok. So we're going to see more and more of that. So the goal overall is to keep African data in Africa to lower both cost and latency. So there's no need to be hopping around that you want to send transactions. You have to go all the way to Europe and come back to Ghana. Then it's long, waste money, and it's unnecessary. So identity and payments. And the thing here is speed as a competitive advantage. So I think we all know what identity is. And the thing is, digital KYCs need real-time database accesses. So where different apps can all query the database and say, oh, is this person who they say they are? So whether it's your fintech apps, your loan apps, your driver's license, your applications for certain things, they need a real-time database access that has as low latency as possible. And also payments, cross-border settlement requires millisecond precision. And I'll use this to tell us a story. I don't know how many people are old enough to remember this, but I remember a time when transactions in Nigeria, digital transactions took 3 days. And I think that time they were using the NEFT protocol. And when an NIBSS came out, it took 24 hours. And then later it dropped to an hour. And the expected time dropped to about 10 minutes. And then later 2-3 minutes. And now we are seeing 3 seconds. And what we've actually seen is in that time is increased infrastructure. So whether it's the NIBSS improving how it was, localizing their servers in Nigeria, and actually having different instances. Now, what we have is different instances of NIBSS in each of the different banks' servers. So what that means is UBA is not necessarily having to talk to Zenith Bank at the end of the day to say, oh, these are all my customers that transacted today with your bank. What is happening is in real time, UBA is saying one of my customers wants to transfer money to you. Does he have the balance and everything? And they quickly run that transaction. It's happening instantaneously because all of these banks are talking together now and not necessarily talking through one channel. And what we've seen in the past 2-3 years, especially in Nigeria, is faster transactions. And because of the increase in faster transactions, we've seen people increasingly adopt digital channels for transactions. And because of that, people are now, you can now go to your market. I mean, 5 years ago, your Aboki was not going to collect transfer. But nowadays, it's not every time, but we are increasingly seeing a lot of them being willing to actually accept transfers rather than, cash and all of that. And this has actually created an opportunity for them. Now that Aboki has a digital record on all his transactions, as against when in the older days, he only had cash records and there was no way he could have actually been financially included. But because he now has transaction data, you can now create particular financial services for him. So whether that is loan services and all of that, and that also translates into trade in Africa. Because of when you start seeing faster transaction and increased adoptions where people can actually quickly transfer money from Nigeria to Ghana from an app, and those people get it in 5 minutes, 2 minutes, you start seeing a situation where people are not necessarily following the BDCs again. And then because they now have a digital trade, a digital record of their transactions, you can now create more creative services like trade enabling products, trade financing, and all of that. So speed is a competitive advantage, and this is why we have to host our data in here and actually run all that routing locally. So here's a fun fact. 500 million Africans lack formal digital identification. So, but with DPIs like Nigeria's NIN hosted in local servers, it will become easier to actually scale this product for both cross-border e-commerce and trade. Carrier neutrality as interoperability. Now, we talked about interoperability earlier and the fact that, 54 different countries trying to communicate in different ways. Now, if you nationalize or you have a particular set of ways you operate your data center. So in this case, if there's only one route to get to your data center, say to get to our data center, you always have to go to just say, let's, for instance, MTN. What happens is in those other different countries, how does MTN communicate with MTN Ghana? So this is where neutrality comes in. Neutrality allows people to seamlessly interconnect. So at Rack Center, what we have is we are a carrier neutral ecosystem. So what we've seen is most of the banks that we have, fintechs and all of that, can talk to each other directly. So whether or not, like I mentioned earlier, any bank can quickly tell you that I'm transferring money your way, approve it, we'll settle ourselves later, because they have that direct interconnection. They don't even need systems where NIBSS servers are lodged elsewhere, but because they are both at Rack Center, it makes it easier for them to talk. Or is it in the case where a bank can quickly talk with their cloud providers, let's say an Oracle or Google, because they are both in the same place. So they don't necessarily have to ping Oracle servers in the US. They can all do that in a data center, in Rack Center, in Nigeria. And that makes it very, very fast for them to communicate. It reduces the data cost because from, say, trying to communicate from Nigeria to US, they have to talk to about 10 different carriers. So whether that's MTN local, the fiber optic owner, the fiber optic owner that will land when you get to US, all of this transit costs, all these different transits actually turn to costs and actually make it very, very expensive and also increase the latency, the time it takes to actually fulfill that message. And also, we also have things like cloud on ramps, like I mentioned. So physical links to direct cloud providers. So if, say, a Meta on Amazon, it's a Rack Center, it makes it easy for you, if you use Meta services, to actually communicate with them rather than having to go to Meta US. Very, very easy. And this is where carrier neutrality comes in, because nobody is threatened by anything. You're not trying to take their business. MTN can come and co-locate with you. Airtel can come there. Glo can come there, which is not, it is an advantage they can't do in their own data centers. They can all come to you and know that you are not trying to take away their business. And that's where carrier neutrality comes in. And also for trade in Africa, neutrality is the key thing to actually drive that. And reliability, like I mentioned, in a power efficient economy like Nigeria, everybody wants to be able to transfer money and not have to pray that the banks or whoever has lights. And this is actually the heartbeat of digital trade. So Rack Center, we've been in operation since 2013. We started the data center when it wasn't obvious, when it wasn't the obvious thing to do in Nigeria, so I'm sure in 2013, most people had not even started using the internet on their smartphones. Smartphones were not even anything, it was still BlackBerry then. Android was still very nascent as a technology in Nigeria. I think then it was just only Apple. So what actually prompted us to do this was we are a forward-thinking company. We always, anticipate the needs ahead. And we've been always on since 2013, meaning we've not had any downtime. We've been 100% up all through, because what we do is we have backups to our backups. So all our generating systems have another backup. All our cooling systems have another backup, because we understand that we are a critical infrastructure. And, imagine the ecosystem going down for 60 minutes or 60 seconds, that is millions of dollars lost in cross-border settlements. And, it will take some days to actually reconcile all of that back. And we know that we are that critical infrastructure, which is why reliability is very, very strong, because reliability ultimately turns to trust. So I'm sure many people now, when they want to go out, they don't necessarily think that I pray there's network on my bank. You just go there, transfer, and it goes. It's because of that reliability that has been communicated. That is why they can't do that. And reliability is also the benchmark for DPIs, because imagine having a digital public infrastructure and you're putting it on a data center that is not reliable. And like I said, and you're praying that there is light, or you're running the payment rails and, you have to be like, oh, there's a possibility the servers are down or, there's nothing powering them. So reliability is very, very key for digital trade, as it drives a lot of things and actually, ingrains people's trust in you. Because if I use you 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, and every time you delivered on the same pop promise of 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 seconds, I'm not going to, think about it going forward. I'm going to increase my adoption with you and use them for more other things. All right. And here's another thing. Fun fact, because of data centers in Nigeria or, in Africa, $5 billion will be saved in terms of annual conversion costs when for transactions. So typically what we had in the older days is to transfer money to Ghana, you have to first transfer it to a US domiciled account or a US domiciled bank that will now transfer the money to Ghana. But with PAPs and the fact that we can actually process all of these transaction costs locally, you remove all that conversion cost of Naira to dollar, dollar to cedis, cedis to dollar, dollar to Naira. You can save yourself a lot of conversion costs because all of these things are hosted locally. And PAPs being a DPI platform, and I'll call it DPI because, it's very, very key for trade, being able to send all the banks in Africa, being able to communicate directly. So basically scaling what we have with NIBSS in Nigeria across Africa is a very, very interesting value proposition. So I can imagine a future where sending money from Nigeria to Ghana will take 5 seconds, like what we have now in Nigeria with our interbank transactions. So a lot of money is saved because of critical infrastructure that we provide. And lastly, and I think we've talked about this, I mentioned this severally, data sovereignty and trust. So it's not all doom and gloom. We are not at the worst place right now. We're beginning to see critical industries host their data locally in Nigeria. Like I gave you, for instance, the financial companies, CBN has mandated that all transaction data and customer data should be stored in Nigeria. Some processing can be outside the country in terms of, switching costs and all of that. However, the core data should be stored, and which is the first step to a good thing. Later on, we'll begin to see some of these transactions actually fully processed in Nigeria, and that will actually increase, adoption of data centers and our usage. And the trust layer, local residencies, the fact that we can now trust the NIS systems, and we can actually believe in it would also help, data sovereignty and compliance. So scaling for the future. Like I mentioned, Rack Center is not an idea. It's actually a live data center, and we've been on since 2013. Last year, we launched our 12 megawatt AI-ready data center called LGS2. Now, LGS2 is, and what I mean by AI-ready power data center is, typically workloads, from banks are like 10 megawatts or 10 kilowatts, sorry. AI workloads are typically 40 to 60 kilowatts. That's the rack, how much power they consume. And Rack Center can actually do that currently, both in cooling and everything. So we are, again, preparing for the future of what we are seeing, the future where higher density compute is going to be on the continent. And currently our data center is the largest, most connected data center in West Africa, both in terms of capacity and in terms of the amount of connections we have. So what that means is all the telcos are at our data center. All the subsea cables, about 8 of them, are at our data centers. We also have cloud providers at our data centers. We also have the content delivery networks at that. So we have all of this interconnection ecosystem. And the goal here is to even have platforms like PAPs also hosted at our data center. So the banks can actually quickly interconnect and talk to themselves running on this PAPs network. And this will ultimately drive trade across the continent because of all this interconnection happens at a single place. So you are able to talk to your different banks and settle yourself your transactions faster. Also, like you said, you can't think about power. Power is an afterthought in data center. It should be the first thing you think about. And currently, Rack Center is also the most sustainable data center in West Africa, or if we say Africa. We have the lowest PUE, that is the power utilization. So how much power are you generating and how much of it are you using? We currently have the lowest. So we have the lowest wastage of highest efficiency in terms of power usage. And also we built LGS2 to be green. So we are currently the only fully gas powered primary powered capture solution in West Africa. So fully gas powered for our size, is significant. And also we have a blend of both gas and solar. So we actually built it to be sustainable from the design from the onset. And this is also part of, the green AfCFTA goals. So the idea is not just to generate as much power as you can and then get a diesel generator and pollute everywhere. It's also to do this sustainably and ensure that you are doing this as ethically as possible. And that's what we've been able to achieve with LGS2. So in conclusion, Rack Center, again, we're looking at the future and we are building that infrastructure right now. In fact, our mantra in-house is ready for today, built for tomorrow. So in conclusion, and how we are building for trade in 2030, because it's going to be a long journey. It's not something that can be solved overnight, but it's something we are all doing in the right direction. And I believe that the AfCFTA is actually doing this in the right direction. So you have to localize to globalize. Hosting locally is the first step to scaling regionally, where every country hosts all their customer data and are all interconnected by a system like PAPS and all of that. Reliability is non-negotiable. You need 100% uptime for the baseline for DPI. It's not a situation where Nigeria is 100% up and Ghana is 95%. That difference can actually create a lot of mistrust in the system and actually cause a lot of misalignment. And also the infrastructure is here right now. Rack Center is already a gateway to Nigeria. We are powering a very strong ecosystem, both for banks, for cloud partners and providers. And we know that, being an AfCFTA digital market gateway is also part of our goals for that. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Adebola. Very practical and very real. Now let's pause again for questions. If you're thinking about hosting strategy, regional deployments, or how early infrastructure choices affect growth, this is the moment. So we'll take a couple of questions and Adebola will answer them. Thank you.
Okay. Should I go? I can see some questions already here. Should I just go from them?
Please go ahead.
All right. So the first one, from your experience, what are the top operational challenges when scaling data center to support Pan-African digital services? So in the older days, the initial thought pattern was create as much data centers across the continent as possible, so have as much locations. But what we're seeing now is with the advent of larger and more subsea cables, it actually becomes easier to communicate with Ghana. So like in the map I showed earlier, there is that connectivity between Nigeria and Ghana. Because in the older days, when we're talking about terrestrial cables, so let's say I want to have my data center connected between Nigeria and Ghana, I have to talk with the Nigerian government. I have to talk with the Togolese government. I have to talk with the Beninese government. Then I have to discuss also with the Ghanaian government because these are terrestrial fibers going through their land borders. But that particular issue has been solved now with having subsea cables outside their sovereign coasts. So we've actually seen a lot of improvement in that, and we are actually seeing more investment in that, in those cablings touching the different regions. Recently we had the Criano cable from Google, And also we had the 2FA from Meta. So yeah. The next question, how do you design data center operations to ensure consistent uptime and service quality across multiple without varying infrastructure reliability? Really, we have one in just in Nigeria, but I can tell you this. When you are designing your data center, and for the particular infrastructure you're looking at, so for instance, we're a tier 3 data center, which means we can only be down by 96 minutes in an entire year. Like if you had the entire total time you are down, we are fully 100%. And one of the cool things you need to look at is look at the region. So you don't just import how data centers in the UK are built and bring them to Nigeria because we are a tropical climate. So data centers like cooling is actually impacted. So how do you work on your cooling? How do you work on your water usage? How do you ensure that all of these things are coming together and are done in a reliable way so you just have these baseline systems and then you apply that across the board for all your data centers. So it's something where you have to have African specialty in building data centers. You can't just import. And that's what we saw with LGS2. Even if we had foreign partners, we had to give them our decade-long of experience as to how to actually build data centers in Africa. Okay. What are the key considerations for hosting services and to comply? Okay. So for one thing that we do at the RAC Center, like I said, because we're a carrier-neutral ecosystem, and we've also had that compliance factor removed from it. So we are also NDPR and GDPR compliant. So if, like for instance, we have some of our clients that actually interconnect with us from Liberia, and what we're able to do is generate a hybrid system for them where some of their the user data are actually hosted in Liberia, but the processing actually happens in Nigeria. For a Nigerian business, we already have that covered with the fact that we are localized for them, and all that data stays here. So what we're seeing nowadays is most companies are actually taking a hybrid solution to this. Data stored here, processing happens elsewhere. But in the future, and I'm sure sovereignty will turn to that, where processing should also happen in our local borders. What are the key considerations for, okay, I think I've read this. Do you see a preference for centralized versus regionalized data center models I would say, preference for centralized versus regionalized data center models for supporting AfCFTA. And I will just mostly say this because I think I really don't understand the context in what you mean by centralized or regionalized. But I would say neutrality is the key way to go for this. And like I showed you, there is a lot of work that has actually been done on the key infrastructure connecting all of these data centers together. So rather than a data center brand trying to create, like what we saw in the older days, where, for instance, Main One had their own data center, but Main One was also the telecommunications provider generating connectivity to that data center. What you should have now is ecosystem neutrality, where all these data centers are actually neutral and you can actually bring in everybody and every partner that actually wants to connect to you. And I think that is actually the key to driving inter-African trade. With increasing So with increasing cybersecurity threats, what operational strategies do you implement to secure data and maintain trust in Pan-African digital services? So a data center is first things first, a physical infrastructure. So at RAC Center, for instance, we have 10-layer security. So you can't, what this means is get into our data center, you can't enter it. There's ID verification. There's prior approval into getting into that data center. And then we have multiple stopgaps along the way, tracking your every entry and exit into that data center. So it's a very, very secure facility where, if there's any form of cybersecurity threat, it's not going to come from the data center. And what you mostly see from cybersecurity is about 60 to 70% of cyber, if not almost 80%, comes from the users. So this is maybe somebody falling victim to phishing, emails, and all of these different scam emails and psychological things. But really, when it comes from the physical infrastructure, most of it, we are very, very secure on that. And cybersecurity threat largely comes from the end users. From an operator's perspective, what infrastructure investments? Okay. So I would say more connectivity between, data between countries, which I think some, which we already have now. We have about 8. I think all the coasts across West Africa are actually connected currently, but it doesn't hurt to have more. We also need to have more data centers across the different regions. Like I mentioned, our 12 megawatts data center facility is the largest currently in Africa. But as Mr. Debo mentioned, we have a depth of gap to actually fill up. We have about 2.5% of the IT load, generated, like hosted in Africa. It's significantly small. So we need more investments in connectivity. We need more investments in data centers, and also we need more investments in local connectivity. So it's not just connectivity in Lagos. We should be able to go into the terrestrial inlands and have connectivity for that, fibers that are going in that direction. And also security. Security is very, very important, because the moment you start talking about terrestrial fibers, you also have to secure them, that somebody doesn't just go up to dig it up and, ensure and, cause chaos. So you also need to have both investments in connectivity, data centers, and security. From the AfCFTA perspective, how are you approaching the need for data sovereignty per country? So, I'll let the AfCFTA people talk about it, but from what I know is, and I'll use PAPS as an example. So PAPS has a framework that allows banks communicate. So they are not necessarily taking out your sensitive data out in that transaction information. They're not necessarily taking your sensitive data out of it. The sensitive data remains with the bank. The banks are just communicating in terms of how much money they want transferred or not. And I think that those are, perspective and things that are actually being worked on by the AfCFTA on that. You mentioned banks having to host their data locally. What are the risks involved if they're not having to use cloud infrastructures? What are the risks involved? So I won't say there's any risk. If anything, I'll say this is actually better sale than actually using cloud, because if your bank was hosting your data in, say, Amazon, for instance, I'm sure you guys also saw. It's not as if Amazon is a thing. Amazon is also using a data center. And earlier this year, their data center, or last year actually, the data center had 2 outages that more or less killed the entire internet. But you know what did not kill? Nigerian transactions. Because why? All of those transactions, all of that data was hosted locally here. So it allowed you to keep on transacting without necessarily being affected by a global outage by, say, Amazon. You get so there is no risk to that. If anything, there is significant benefit to it. All right. Or do we have local? Yeah, we have some people who are building local cloud infrastructure in Nigeria. Adoption is still pretty much low because people work with what they're familiar with. But we should actually say a world in which, for instance, MTN now, they have their own cloud solutions. Airtel have their own cloud solutions, and these are local cloud solutions built for Nigeria. So we would actually start seeing some of these people and some of these companies participating there. We even have smaller players like Kasi Cloud and all of that building their own local cloud solutions that will actually be tailored to the Nigerian audience. And last question, how much does it cost to build a data center in Nigeria? Okay, so I would say it this way. Data centers are power intensive units. So we're basically generating power and connectivity. So we think of it as a power generation station. And then we're saying, come and bring your rack. Let me just simplify it in that way. Bring your servers and all of that here. So for every megawatt of power, to generate a megawatt of power, currently in Nigeria, it costs between $13 to $15 million. So you can just get a sense of how expensive it is. It's a very, very expensive business. So so if you want to generate 12 megawatts like we did, you can, do the math on that. So yes, it costs about 14 or let's say 13 to 15 million dollars per megawatt, depending on your design and how efficient you are, capital efficient that you are, because unfortunately, most of the things that you use in a data center are still imported. So you have your cooling systems, which are largely imported, fiber trunking, but we're beginning to see some Nigerian companies like Coleman building fibers in Nigeria. So, and some of these particular things are fully imported. Your UPS systems, all of these things are imported. So you are largely pegged to the dollar, and also our import laws and tariffs and all of that also really affect the cost when you are building a data center. So, yeah.
I think you've done justice to this. Thank you very much, Adebola. This was very, very educative. We are far behind time. We've talked about the why and how. Now let's look at DPI in action. Our final segment is a real-world case. It's a real-world case study. This will show us how identity and payment infrastructures is being deployed and scaled across African markets today. I'm very pleased to welcome Chimezie Emewulu, the Chief Executive Officer of SeamFIX. SeamFIX operates at the heart of DPI, supporting governments and enterprises with identity authentication and payment enablement across multiple countries. Chimezie will share a practical lesson on what it takes to scale DPI-enabled solutions, what works, what breaks, and what businesses must design for early adoption. Welcome, Chimezie. Thank you for being here, and over to you.
Thank you so much to the OND, the NITD, and the Digital Trade Desk for this invitation. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Hello? Yes, okay.
Yes, we can.
So good morning once more to everybody joining us from different parts of the continent and beyond. What I want to share here today is it's not a marketing presentation, it's not a celebration of SeamFIX as a company. It's more of a practitioner story. It's a story about what we've learned by building and deploying digital trust infrastructure in real African markets under real regulatory conditions and at real scale. So my role in this session will typically be to complement the excellent conversations that has been led by my two former colleagues. But then I need to answer one practical question. And that question is, when we say the DPI is the foundation for AfCFTA scale, what does that actually look like when you implement it? So that's the journey I'll take you in the next few minutes. My role today is simply going to be to connect those dots from the perspective of implementation, talk about what actually breaks and what actually works, and what DPI looks like when theory actually meets reality. So let me start by naming a paradox that we all recognize. Today Africa has demand, we have talent, we have capital, and then with AfCFTA, we now have a shared policy ambition for cross-border trade. But you see, despite all this, most startups and digital enterprises, they still struggle, especially the moment they want to move from one country to the other. So what we discovered very early is that this difficulty has very little to do with ambition or innovation, but it has everything to do with trust. So the same person, the same business, the same transaction is treated as unknown in another country. So it's known in one country, unknown in another country. The moment it crosses the border, that is where the problem actually starts. So identity is fragmented and it has to still be reproven. Compliance has to now be reinterpreted under a new framework within a new country. Payment probably has to now be reauthorized. So even though the AfCFTA reduces physical barriers, but digital trade borders actually so far has quietly remained. So, and what we are seeing is that those borders are enforced through trust systems. So this is actually where digital public infrastructure becomes very essential, because it's at its core, the DPI is not abstract. It solves three fundamental excuse me. It solves three fundamental questions that every economy must answer at scale. First one, my colleagues have talked about it, they've all mentioned identity. So the first one is, who exactly are you? That's identity. And the second one is, can value move safely? That's payment. The third one is, can systems agree without repeatedly burdening people and burdening businesses? And that's data, and that's interoperability, that's connection. So when DPI is strong, trust will stop becoming negotiated manually. Trust will become repeatable, it becomes programmable, and it becomes scalable. And this is extremely critical under AfCFTA. Why? It's critical because regional trade will not work if trust must be reestablished from scratch for every new market. So this is how DPI will become the infrastructure, actually not friction. So DPI is really very important. And SeamFIX's journey into DPI did not begin with payment or trade corridors. It actually began with identity, because identity is the layer on which everything else stands on. The radical transformation you are going to see in Africa is, or radical, at least from my view, the radical transformation, the growth you're going to see in Africa will start from the foundation of identifying who the heck is engaging in what transaction. Who are we? Who are you? So in every country that we've worked on, we've observed the same pattern. When identity systems are weak, regulators will quickly tighten control. Onboarding will slow down. Innovation will struggle to breathe. But when identity systems are strong and they are trusted and they are interoperable, something very interesting starts happening. Markets will start opening up naturally. So our focus in SeamFIX was very deliberate. Our focus was to build identity systems that could operate at national scale and align with government policies, and at the same time still be usable by the private sector. So working with national identity authorities across multiple countries, it's taught us an important lesson about DPI. One is that DPI succeeds when it's designed for real operating conditions, real ones, not ideal ones. And real operating conditions means you have to work offline, for example. So we've seen fantastic data of internet connectivity and stuff, but most vast swaths of Africa is unconnected. They're offline. So those people, when you are designing solutions that will onboard them or work for them, it has got to work offline. And it has got to check and get the quality of information you need, even in that offline manner. So that means it will support millions of people, not thousands, millions. It means it's going to align deeply with national policy objectives like mandatory identity frameworks. Look at Nigeria, for example, have the mandatory use of NIN. So whatever you're designing has to align with that gazetted document of mandatory use of identity. And similar frameworks is also popping up in different countries. So if you look at it, identity in this context is not just a credential stored in a database. It becomes like a gateway to education, a gateway to financial services or financial inclusion, a gateway to communication inclusion, digital inclusion, a gateway to mobility, a gateway to increasingly participating in cross-border digital trade. Today, movement across Africa is, why should people in Africa need a visa to move around within Africa? Simply because maybe the person on the other side doesn't even know who you are and only knows if they allow you to travel without visa, it means they only know about you the moment you show up. They have no clue. They have no way of knowing before you even show up. So the thing is this, if DPI fails, especially at the identity layer, AfCFTA will become structurally exclusionary, even if it is unintended. So what we've done, we've worked with NIMC, we've set up enrollment infrastructure for national ID. We also worked with them to enable full implementation of the mandatory use of NIN. We've had to face situations where ensuring the quality of data collected is right, and that the actual person is in the present moment is the same person. The person is alive in the present moment, the same person that you're collecting the information from, even in an offline manner. So you're able to also do face quality checks and ensure it conforms to the ISO standard and whatever standard for that country. Standard by default will be ISO or the ICAO standard, and then fingerprint to check and ensure it conforms to some other standards like the NIST standard. So you need to do all these things in an offline manner and still enable that enrollment to happen in using a form factor like Android, such that they're able to go deep into the countries, deep into the hinterland, and they're able to enroll people and give them ID so that they can be included. So working with NIMSI, we were able to boost enrollment numbers from under 5 million to over 100 million and counting. So also, one important clarification I want to make is this. DPI is not only a public sector concern. So most of the severe trust failures that we've encountered, they actually occur in the private sector. Yes, they actually do. Particularly in highly distributed ecosystems like the telecoms, the financial services, and agent networks. The moment you have distribution of agents, people that can violate your system at will, especially when you track transactions to their username and password, not to their identity, there you have a problem. So when identity is weak in these environments, fraud would scale faster than innovation. So regulators would immediately start responding with enforcement. Businesses will start responding with friction. And then everybody starts complaining that this thing is too difficult. The regulators don't make life easy for us. So, but DPI actually enables a shared trust layer where private markets can operate with confidence without constantly triggering regulatory alarms. So in this sense, DPI is more like a stabilizer between innovation and oversight. So if you look at MTN as a group, in fact, let's specifically zero down to MTN Nigeria. In 2015, they got a fine of $5.2 billion due to some infractions. They had so much data that they collected that was not meeting some basic quality. In fact, you're tracking some terrorists, for example, and you ask for the SIM that it was registered to, and you see that it was registered to President Obama. How on earth did you register that SIM to Obama? Like, how did that happen? So Obama never showed up to buy any SIM. So what happened? So, but when we came in, we realized that we needed to bring in a system that checks for the quality and confirms that the user you are collecting that data from is alive, is in the present moment, is the same person. You're able to check all this even in an offline manner while the user is still there. When the system is not connected to the backend, when the network has failed, it will still need to process that data and collect it and push it to the back. And at the back, it still needs to do so many other levels of processing. So after doing that and solving that problem, we now realize the bigger problem, which is the agent network, because the agents can get away with the fact that they just have a username and a password. So they can claim it wasn't them. And now we're rolling out a system focused on federating identities of agents, but with using biometrics as a second factor authentication, so that there is no way you can claim it was not you that authenticated and did that transaction. AfCFTA is often discussed in terms of goods and services, but there's another dimension that matters deeply, and that dimension is people. African citizens, they move, they study abroad, they work abroad, they trade across barriers. But you see, once citizens move and leave their home country, then their identity immediately becomes fragile. Let me pause here a little bit and make this personal, because this issue is not abstract to me. So I relocated from Nigeria to the UK. I was sent to the UK as a sole representative of my company. We wanted to expand to the developed economies and actually export our solutions to the developed world, to the Europe and the Americas. So I had to come to the UK. And when I came, I thought maybe naively that proving who I was straightforward. I mean, I'm a documented individual. I run companies with a lot of regulators overseeing us in multiple African countries. I have government deployments, board references, professional history that is well established. If you search online, you see a lot of details about me. And I thought maybe it's easy for me to prove my identity. But when I came, I tried to open a bank account. And guess what? 14 times I was told no by Main Street banks. 14 times. They all said no. I mean, it's easier for them to say no. I tried to rent a home, I encountered the same pattern. Why? Why was that so? So within Nigeria or within Africa, we can take the pains of going to check. But outside that ecosystem, you realize that the identity system is so fragmented that external people that want to check have no place they can easily go and check. And what they do is they default to just saying no. So there was no evidence of risk, but there was absence of trusted, interoperable signal that these institutions can rely on. So from the institution's perspective, rather than chasing fragments of information across different jurisdictions, which is costly, which is risky, it's simpler and safer for them to just say no. So what you see here is that exclusion has happened, not because somebody is not qualified, but simply because trust has not yet traveled with that person across border. So the trust that you have in Nigeria, the moment you leave Nigeria or you leave Ghana or you leave Cameroon, that trust may not necessarily travel with you. And that becomes a problem. And that's why DPI matters a lot, especially for citizens, especially for those that are outside the shores of their country. So when identity systems are interoperable, when they are verifiable, and when they are recognized across ecosystems, people do not have to always be reintroducing themselves to the world every time. DPI will now turn visibility into infrastructure. It will now allow institutions to safely say yes instead of just defaulting to no. So under AfCFTA, the same principle will apply to businesses, to entrepreneurs and innovators that are trying to operate across multiple African markets. So physical presence requirements and consular bottlenecks, manual verification processes, these are all things that create invisible barriers. But DPI will allow governments to maintain trusted relationships with their citizens, wherever they are in any part of the world. So what I'm essentially saying is that the continuity of identity is essential, not just for public services, but for trade, for remittances, for long-term regional integration. Like I said, this is personal to me. So from an African perspective, if you look at it, payment innovation across Africa has been what I will call extraordinary. Speed is introduced, especially with PAPS, for example. My colleague that just finished mentioned PAPS a lot of times. So speed is introduced, a lot of speed. Monies, from what I understand from the last PAPS Cowrie event, the SLA that PAPS has is about 2 minutes to move transactions cross-border. So that's a lot of speed. These transactions used to take 3 days, sometimes up to 1 week before it could be moved before. And you had to end up losing about 25% of that money transacting through different sources. I mean, you want to send money from Nigeria to Ghana, you have to send that money to the correspondent bank in London, that will send to correspondent bank in US, that will send it back to Ghana. And different stakeholders are cutting percentages of it. Perhaps has cut out all that and has introduced a lot of speed. But you see, that's the challenge. It is a blessing, and it also introduces a challenge. And what's the challenge? Speed without governance would introduce new risks, especially when you're crossing border. Need to introduce it at scale. So instant payments will move value very fast, more than transitional compliance systems can react. DPI must now evolve from simply enabling transactions to governing intelligence in real time. You see, when identity, payment, and rule enforcement work together, trust will scale. And it will scale with speed, the speed of the transaction, instead of collapsing under it. And that's the difference between enabling transactions and sustaining trade. So at the moment, what SeamFIX has done is we have partnered with PAPS, because the moment PAPS moves money cross-border, you have sovereign countries, maybe Nigeria, maybe Ghana. These are two sovereign countries. The central bank governor of Nigeria and the Bank of Ghana, the governor, for example, you see that these people can ask the people that they are regulating questions and say, who are you sending this money to? So they know within their space who they are debiting. And they know to the extent they've been told who the money is going to.
But once the money crosses border, you really don't know a lot. You have to rely on some instruments to be able to know who the money just went to. So perhaps debit transaction in Nigeria, credit transaction in Kenya, for example. Question is, did we just fund a terrorist? Did we just launder money? I mean, that's not the responsibility of PAPs in reality, because the banks need to do those KYC. But what we've partnered with them to do is to introduce what we call the P gates, where we are able to introduce real-time transaction governance. So while they move monies at scale, we're able to use the instruments of identity that is available to, align and ensure that the monies that are moving, that the right identities are actually the persons that are involved in those transactions. That's what the P gate is really all about. And we signed this, it was announced heavily sometime in December. We're actually at the rollout stage right now. I want to slow down a little bit here and talk about some of the lessons we've learned. Okay. These lessons, from my view, they apply to both innovators and policymakers. So these are not ideas that we arrived at in a strategy session. These are conclusions that we reached after multiple deployments, multiple audits, even ISO audits, and audits from even the DSS, because of the sensitive nature of the work we do. So multiple redesigns, long conversation with regulators across multiple countries. We came to these conclusions. And number one, the first lesson is this: as an innovator, it's important that you build with the regulators. Don't build around them, build with them. So many startups, they see regulation as an obstacle, something to be navigated after you finish building the product. But we think in DPI work, that approach would fail very quickly. Because when governance is bolted in at the end, then these systems become, like, how would I put it, very brittle, right? They will break under scrutiny. When you shine a torch on them, they will break. So what we've learned is that regulators are actually not trying to slow down innovation. They are trying to preserve trust at scale. So while you've innovated something, which is brilliant, and maybe your target market is people that have smartphones that are in this category and that category, the regulator is thinking, okay, this is beautiful, but what about these vulnerable people that can be taken advantage of? What about these other people that are not included? So the regulators are thinking about it holistically. And it would be selfish if you just think of only one segment and ignore the real problems that that segment will create. So you design a solution for people that are smart, upwardly mobile and stuff, and the criminals take advantage of that to defraud the people that are vulnerable. Those are the things the regulators are worried about. So it's important you design and build with the regulators. So when you design systems that make regulatory intent visible, auditable, enforceable by default, then regulators will become like partners rather than gatekeepers. So we think that DPI succeeds when policy is translated into architecture, not paperwork. The second lesson is that interoperability will beat dominance. I know a lot of people want to be the only person doing this, the primary person, dominant. But what is important is actually interoperability. We don't think under the AfCFTA that we'll have one dominant player that wins everything. In many markets, the instinct will typically be to build the biggest system and hope that everyone will conform to it. But under AfCFTA, what we are, from our analysis, we are seeing that there's no single system that will dominate across countries, across sectors and institutions. So what will scale instead are systems that speak to each other. Systems that accept multiple identities, they integrate different data sources. You don't say, oh, this has to be the only way to do it. There are so many other ways to do it. And you have to design systems that respect and integrate to all those different frameworks. So you have to respect the local rules while still operating within a shared framework. So from my view, interoperability is not going to be a technical convenience. It's going to be like a political and economic necessity for regional trade. So the third lesson is, I think it's deceptively simple actually, and is that identity comes before payment. Even though today we front-load payment, but identity actually comes before it. So we often try to accelerate financial inclusion by pushing the payment rails first. But when identity is weak, payment systems will inherit that weakness, and the risk will scale faster than trust will scale. You have different people taking advantage of that risk and scaling it way beyond, and it leads to that system collapsing quicker, and it leads to trust deficit, and it leads to people just withdrawing from it and not actually allowing it to work out. So we believe that strong identity creates accountability. It will enable proper dispute resolution. It will give regulators the confidence that is required for them to maybe give you the approval that you're seeking for. So you see, payments will move value, but identity will underpin responsibility, to anchor your responsibility, to make sure that you are very clear. You see, we rolled out a platform that introduces second factor authentication using biometrics. And we are seeing that that system quickly removes fraud. It quickly eliminates the person from saying, it was not me that logged in. It was not me that did this. Okay, it is you. We can see you. That's your biometrics. That's you when you are logging in. That's the confirmation. So it would bring back the responsibility to where it is. So under AfCFTA, what we believe is that sustainable financial scale will depend on getting identity right and getting it right the first time. The fourth lesson is that compliance cannot remain manual. Manual compliance might work at small volumes, but AfCFTA is designed for scale, and millions of transactions, millions of actors across multiple jurisdictions is what we are going to be seeing. So if you look at Africa, just sub-Saharan Africa alone is about 1.4 billion persons. Those are the people that will get involved. Those are the people that will make payments. Those are the people that needs to be identified. And they may have multiple identities in different fragments. Maybe I have a driver's license, national ID, international passport. These are in different silos. They're not all connected together. But when you are rolling out systems, compliance must now not be manually dependent on somebody just checking. You need to automate that process, because human-led compliance will introduce delays, it will introduce inconsistencies, it will introduce blind spots. But DPI will allow compliance to be embedded inside different workflows and allow it to be enforced in real time, allow it to be logged automatically and audited retrospectively. It will allow people even move. Yes, move cross-border. Oh, yes. So why will South Africa, for example, get the confidence to maybe allow Nigerians to come to South Africa without visa, or Nigeria to do the same and just show up at the border? There has got to be some level of automation in the identity and the compliance processes between these two nations. Anyway, that's from our view, because this will shift compliance from being a cost center to an enabling layer. Most people or businesses, we've seen that they treat compliance as a cost center, but we think compliance is actually an enabling center. It's like a business differentiator. The fact that you're able to do things right and you're able to do it safely and you're able to protect the categories of people that you have not yet even thought about, who the regulators are worried about. Anyway, the fifth lesson, or the final lesson, is, and this is perhaps the most important lesson, when startups align themselves with DPI, they stop exporting isolated products and they start exporting capabilities. So they will export identity logic, they will export trust frameworks, they will export interoperability models, they will export governance patterns, things that can be reused across markets, not product features. These are not consumer features. These are like fundamental building blocks of national and regional systems. This is how African startups would be able to move from local success stories within their region or within their blocks to continental relevance. So we think that under AfCFTA, the most powerful exports will not just be apps. They will typically be infrastructure that allows trade, they allow inclusion, and actually allows trust to scale. So from our view in SeamFIX, when these lessons come together, AfCFTA will stop being an aspiration. It will become like an operating system. And underpinning all this will typically be trust. So the trust infrastructure, once built across Africa, would enable radical growth. We want an Africa that is growing, and an Africa that trades amongst itself is a growing Africa. And finally, from our view, AfCFTA does not need more applications. It just needs a shared trust infrastructure, something that just works across borders, across sectors, across institutions. So when identity and payments and data, when these interoperate safely, then the startups will scale by default. The regulators will gain visibility without friction. And Africa's innovation will move with confidence. It will move with caution. So this is the promise of DPI, and that's the opportunity that we have if we build it well. Thank you so much. You're muted, Mr. Shea.
Thank you, Chimezie. That was extremely insightful. Let's now go into the question and answer session because I know there was a lot of practical learnings and people have a lot of questions to ask. The technical team will now put up the questions that people have been putting in while your session was going on. We'll just take about 10 minutes to answer them, and I'll then wrap up the day so that we'll have a closing time. Now, question and answer. So you can pick the questions from the screen.
Okay, so the question number 1 says, what has been the biggest operational challenges in scaling identity? Sorry, my camera is here, my screen is here. So when I'm looking here, I'm looking at the camera. When I'm looking at the screen trying to read out. So I have 2 screens, so please don't think I'm not looking. So what has been the biggest operational challenges in scaling identity and payment solutions across multiple African markets? I think it's more about the standards. It's more about the different standards. And also, this is also something I would like to take on with the infrastructure guys. Also more about the data sovereignty. Each country also have their own data requirements, So so from a standards perspective, let me put it this way. There are so many ID systems that don't just speak to each other. So there's a lot of fragmentation that happens. So if you look at countries like Nigeria, Nigeria is now harmonizing everything under the NIN. But in different countries, or rather even within Nigeria, you have the voters identity database, the driver's license, the international passport. So there's a lot of fragmentation going on. And based on that, you don't have a single source of truth. But in countries like Nigeria now, that has the NIN, which can now be the foundational database, because there are so many functional databases for different industries, the BVN for the banking industry, voters card for everybody that is voting. So harmonizing all that and linking it to some foundation is key. So we've seen that in most countries, that fragmentation exists. So I think that would be what I will refer to as the fundamental challenge, especially when you are rolling out a solution that will talk to those people's identity. You now need to aggregate all those fragmented identities and be able to verify against them across Africa. That's a lot of work. The second question says, what lessons have you learned about building trust with governments, banks, and end users when scaling digital? Well, the fundamental lesson really, trust in itself is something that the moment you lose, even you as an organization, you start having an issue. So in trying to build identity systems that foster trust, you need to be able to provide some level of guarantees for people to even trust you. So what we did, we realized that we're dealing with a lot of sensitive data. So we had to go and do a lot of ISO certifications, ISO 27001 for information security, at least if not for any other thing, we had to align ourselves with some relevant industry standards that anybody we are dealing with can understand that we have some relevant processes in place, because trust starts with, when we are trying to deploy a trust system for you, for the world to trust you, you even have to trust that we know what we are doing and we have some relevant processes in place. So we did ISO 27001 on information security, ISO 27701, privacy and information management, and then another ISO on quality systems. We had to do this to establish baselines and guarantee that we have some minimum processes. So I think from that perspective, you start demonstrating even trust that the person you're working with, the business you want to work with, they can even trust that you have some minimums in place. And then based on that, you can now work with them to establish the required framework for the wider ecosystem. So how do you ensure that your identity and payment systems integrate seamlessly, both national and regional infrastructure? I'm not sure I understand this question. But let me just explain what we are doing, especially right now with PAPS under the AfCFTA agreement. So we are rolling out what we call the P-Gate. P-Gate is a transaction monitoring gateway that moves from reactive transaction monitoring to proactive transaction monitoring. So let's use a very simple use case. A very simple use case, very, very simple, very basic use case. You say that everybody that is in a country, if they are to move more than $10,000 in a day, for example, across border, then they are not, they are supposed to provide extra documentation. Let's say that that's the simple use case. And then somebody wants to move 100,000. What he simply needs to do is divide it. If I'm moving more than 10,000, I'll provide documentation. So I go to 10 banks or 10 financial institutions, 10 here, 10 here, 10 here, 10 here, or even go to 11 banks, 9,000 here, 9,000 there, 9,800 there. By the time I'm done, each of them will be complying, and I won't raise any flag. And I would have moved that money cross-border, and quietly, when they all go to different accounts cross-border, I can converge it into an account. So what is going to be that governance infrastructure that will link up all those identities across all those transactions and be able to say that this person is the same person that's moving all this, so he needs to provide extra documentation. That's a governance that is proactive, not reactive. So while these monies are moving cross-border in an instant manner, some system is proactively saying, well, this guy has moved 10,000. This next one he wants to move for today, even though through a different institution, we need to be clear. What's the documentation for it? Today he has exhausted his personal quota. Now we need an invoice. Now we need clarity. Now we need documentation for this second one. And the system is not going to stop it, for example. It's just going to document and flag it for further investigation to be done. So before, it now moves from that opacity where nobody knows to clarity where people now know and they can ask those questions. Anyway, that's how I look at it. So from a tech perspective, what design decisions have been most critical for ensuring reliability, security, and speed from a tech perspective? Is the design decision that has been most critical for this has been adopting a perspective that everything that can fail will fail. So before we deployed the solution for MTN in 2015, when they had a fine of $5.2 billion, we had a system that was designed to work. So we tried to roll it out for MTN. Obviously, we rolled out that project in 10 days. And we started noticing some patterns. So we had to quickly redesign the system within that same window. And what did we design it to do? We designed it to fail. So at that point, we assumed that everything or every point of failure that can fail will fail. So that's the attitude we adopted, that anywhere failure is possible, that we should treat it as a default, that failure is inevitable. So we looked at the fact that there may be network issues. So we designed the system to respond elegantly to network failures and to ensure it can work even when the network is not working. And it can at least sort out the person and allow the person to go and sort out the network backend syncing when the network comes back. We design it such that if network is going to time out when it starts sending this, it should assume it will time out and design it in such a way that it will recover gracefully. So that's a design attitude that I will encourage. Just design it to fail. And in a way, it's counterintuitive that you design the system to accommodate every form of failure you can think of. So assume those failures will naturally happen. Assume that that's the default thing that will happen. Network will fail, server will fail, the data center will fail. Like a lot of things will go wrong. Assume those things and design within that constraint. Whatever that can fail, just try to design within that constraint and assume that those failures are inevitable. And then treat it from that perspective and watch your system become resilient and elegant. So if I were advising a startup entering multiple African markets, what are the must-do steps for leveraging DPI for cross-border growth? Well, must-do step, I think I'll just focus on one step, which is look at the regulation. One thing that will kill your business very quickly is the regulation. If you don't design with the regulators in mind, if you design around the regulators, you try to be clever around the regulators, you will quickly get into hot water. So it's very important you go and study and understand what's the intention of the regulation, where's the regulation going to, and then get engaged, engage the regulators, try to understand what are they trying to achieve with this, and then design your system to be in alignment. So what has SeamFIX done to ameliorate the breaches that occurred in identity management, multiple name generation, prior to partnering with at national scale? So I'm not certain what this is, but in the NIMC, our system is used for bringing in the persons, enrolling them into the system. So there's another system that is at the back end, which is the ABIS, that manages the deduplication. So that is not a SeamFIX system. So what SeamFIX does at the front end is to ensure that whenever we are collecting data, number one, the person is alive, the person is in the present moment, and the person is the same person. So we have a liveness checking system that when you are taking a picture or you are taking a live selfie, like for example, we rolled out a self-service passport renewal for the government of Benin Republic, and we're also rolling it out in Cote d'Ivoire at the moment. So we realized that we're able to enable citizens in diaspora to use their phone to be able to take a live selfie, and we can confirm they are alive in the present moment, they're the same person, and we're able to collect their fingerprint, and we're able to do a match against everything that is in the back end. So, but the main thing is that in most cases, we enable. We don't completely own the infrastructure. So what we do is to integrate and make sure we interoperate with all the existing players. Like I said in my lessons learned, you can't be the only person. There has got to be other persons working, other persons deploying other things. You can't come and say everybody should just work with only me. No, you have to integrate to others. And when those other systems have issues, the best you can do is go and engage and figure out the best thing you can do to support solving it even at your layer before it goes to that layer. So those are the things. And having worked with MTN, do you think mapping device to specific location will reduce the breach that we have with national identity data? What would reduce the breach is not just mapping device to location. What would reduce the breach, to be very honest and brutal, is tracking. Today, agents that use those devices, they get away with murder. They get away with every nonsense they do because the authentication is not to their person. My dad was kidnapped about 3 years ago. Kidnappers were asking for ransom, and they were asking for ransom through the POS and all these agent outlets. And the people, they also brought account details of people, real people that did not know that they have these that they have those accounts existing. So we saw all those things, and the real problem is this. You see, those agents operating in the streets, they operating SIM registration, mobile money, POS, those agents, they need to use their biometrics to submit every transaction. They need to use their biometrics to authenticate so that every transaction is traced to them. Because you catch the person and you're saying, okay, we noticed this number of transactions, it was tied to this device and tied to this username and password, tied to this location. No problem. The person will tell you it wasn't him. He will show you evidence that he traveled that day. It was his brother or his relative that is using the device. And then the brother shows up and tells you, it's not me, it's another person that used the device that day. You know, say we are 5 of us that use it. So you have 5 people. None of them will agree it is them that logged in and did that transaction. And that's already a fundamental breach. So what would solve that problem is that all those people use their biometrics to log in as a second factor. And then you track every transaction to them as a person. So when you now have an issue, you go straight to the person that authenticated and logged in and say, okay, come, it's you. This is you use this username and password. This is your biometrics when you logged in. Put your fingerprint again, let's confirm, or put your face, let's confirm, and it's still you. That's what solves the problem. Thank you so much.
Thank you very, very much, Chimezie. This was a very, very lengthy learning curve, and thank you for breathing reality into it, for people to understand the reality of what you face every day, running SeamFIX and how far SeamFIX is growing. With that being said, I would like to thank you all once again, especially to the speakers, the facilitators, for sharing such a practical, grounded insights. If there's one takeaway from today's session, It's that digital public infrastructure isn't background infrastructure. It's a strategic enabler of market entry and scale. We encourage you to stay engaged on our WhatsApp group to get live information. Before we wrap up, let me leave you with a quick review of what's coming to the next session looks like. Today, we've talked about the rails, identity, payments, data, interoperability, but rails alone don't get you into the new market. What actually determines whether you can operate, build customers, move data, scale legally across borders is licensing, tax, and compliance. So in our next session, which is not happening today, session 3, we are tackling the questions many founders avoid until it becomes a problem. How do you cross regulatory borders before you cross markets? The session is titled Licensing, Tax, and Compliance for Digital Exports, and it's designed to give you clarity on what regulators expect, what compliance really means in practice, and how to avoid costly missteps as you expand. You will be joined by Mr. Akinola Majoyejobu, who is the co-founder and CEO of Probe Compliance, who will break down AfCFTA and WTO digital trade rules, licensing pathways, and how to design a compliance strategy that supports growth rather than slowing it down. We will also host a regulatory clinic with Mr. Vincent Olatunji, who is the National Commissioner for the National Data Protecting Commission. This is a rare opportunity to hear directly from the regulator on data protection obligations and DPI-related licensing and cross-border data governance. And finally, we'll close with a practical case study from Dr. Olufemi Oyenuga, the Group Executive Director of Chams Holding PLC, who will share first-hand lessons on building, scaling regulated digital services across multiple African markets. If you are serious about exporting digital services, onboarding users across borders, or working with governments and enterprises, Session 3 is where strategy meets reality. We look forward to seeing you there. Thank you for your time today and have a great day.